This is an introduction to interpreting the Bible for interpretive practices. And this is Craig Hill. This is BI 500. All right, welcome. This is a chance for us to talk about what we're going to be talking about for the quarter, which is the idea of interpreting the Bible, and a little bit of an introductory lecture about what are we doing when we come to our Bible, and what are the resources that we have available to us? What sort of observations do we make? So let me just start by asking a question. And this question about what do we do when we read our Bible? And there's a number of things. Not only what am I doing when I read my Bible, but what have I used my Bible for? What has been my approach to the Bible? And as I think back on my own time, I first read the Bible seriously when I was 13 years old, when I heard the gospel for the first time at a Christian rock concert of all places. But I was thinking back in those days when I went to my Bible, probably before my seminary days, there was this sense I was going to it to see if God was speaking to me in any particular way. Or I might have gone to my Bible to answer a particular question that was going on around me, some kind of an issue, and I wanted clarity from the Bible. Or maybe I went to develop a theological stance on an issue. Or maybe I've read it just devotionally. And so if you're anything like me, back in those days, my approach was kind of like a chapter a day keeps the devil away. But it begs the question of asking for ourselves, what has your particular approach been to the Bible? And just to identify, what have you used the Bible for, and what have you been doing when you read the Bible? Now, when we come to this class, we want to be intentional about what we're doing, and we want to look at what our goal is for reading the Bible. And if we think about a goal of interpreting the Bible, the goal of the interpretation of any communicative event, the goal of reading the Bible is the goal of trying to find and uncover the author's intended meaning. So what was the author intending when they wrote it? Now, we do this all the time. We do this when we have a conversation, like these two people on the left-hand side of the screen. When someone is speaking to us or at us, we ascribe to them the respect that they have an intent of what they're trying to communicate. We don't just say, oh, you're saying this, but what you're really saying is this, and they might say, no, what I'm really saying is, I want you to get off that stool. And they're saying, no, I thought you meant that I should stay on this. Anyway, the idea is the author has an intended meaning, and that's true in a conversation. That's also true if somebody writes, say, a letter or some kind of a thing. It's still a communicative event, that when that person sits down to write, that they have an idea in mind about what they're trying to communicate. And so when someone comes to a point of then reading that what they're going to try to do is they're trying to discern what the author is trying to say. Now, we do this in our contemporary society all the time. And there are problems, there are issues, that there are cultural issues, there are linguistic issues sometimes between, even the best of friends can have misunderstandings in communication. Now, if you talk about the New Testament, which was written over 2,000 years ago, in a different culture, on a different continent, that there are going to be possibilities for misunderstanding. But it does not mean that just because there are possibilities of misunderstanding, that we ought not abandon the idea of attempting to recover the author's intended meaning. That's our goal of interpretation. All right, let's go ahead and let's talk about what are some of the resources, the sort of observations that we use when we look at Scripture. And you're going to see that our course, in many ways, if we could go out here for a second, our course in many ways is built around this idea of the text, the co-text, the context, the intertext, and then my context. That there are things that are more about the text, like the text and the co-text, and there are things behind the text, what we might call context or intertext, and there are things that are in front of the text, such as my own social location, my own context. So what we're going to try to do is we're going to talk a little bit about the sorts of observations we make when we come to the text of Scripture. A lot of these observations are indeed built in the text. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is the idea of textual criticism and various different manuscript evidence we have about different readings of passages, and we want to establish what the text is. That's textual criticism. But we're also going to establish what the parameters of a text are. When does a text we're studying begin and end? How does it set apart from the rest of the book in which it is set in? We can talk about the text, talk about genre. What type of a text am I reading here? Am I reading a letter? Am I reading a narrative? Am I reading a psalm? Am I reading a poem? Am I reading a prophetic text? What's the difference then in how I'm coming at that? The same way we might distinguish between reading like a love letter and reading the dictionary. Those are two different types of texts, and we expect different things out of them. We can also talk about words and phrases, and we would use original language, Greek or Hebrew, to talk about what are significant words or significant phrases. We might also make observations about the grammar or syntax. We might also make observations about how the author is making the point that they want to make. Is he using sarcasm? Is he using humor? Is he using, or he or she using alliteration? So rhetorical questions. So those are all issues and observations that can be made from within the text itself. If we move on, other kinds of observations we might make are about what we would call the co-text, or text around the text that we're dealing with. So we would ask questions about, does anything come before the passage that helps us make sense of the passage? Does anything come after the passage in the book that you're reading that would make sense of the passage? So, in other words, are there significant themes within the book as a whole that your passage in particular deals with? Is the author's overall argument of the book somehow coming out more specifically in this passage? And where does this passage fit in the overall outline of the book? Is where it's placed in the book significant to how we interpret the passage? We'll take a look at some texts in our next lecture that might make sense of kind of what these sort of observations do. And what I want to focus on when we look at a book, and you look at a book as a whole, a good macro reading of a book, I always encourage my students to look at what's the structure of the book and what are the themes in the book. So how is the author structuring their argument or structuring their presentation, and are there significant themes that show up in whatever portion of the book we're talking about? Let's move on to another sort of observation that we would make, and those are observations about what we're going to call context. Now, when we talk about context here, we're not just talking about context, what we would call the co-text. We're talking about what's behind the text. What is the history that's going on when this text is being written? What's the cultural context that's going on behind this text? Is this text dealing more with the Jewish backgrounds? Or is this text dealing more with Greco-Roman backgrounds? So, and also to ask the question about, why does the author take up a pen in hand and start to write this psalm? Or why does the author pick up his pen and write the book of Deuteronomy? Or why does he pick up his pen or her pen and write the Gospel of Matthew? Or why the epistle to the Romans? What is the occasion that's going on? These are all things that aren't necessarily, they might not be shown up exactly in the text itself, but we kind of make observations that imply that there's something going on behind the text. And we want to bring that out. This is kind of behind the text or between the lines of the text. Is there a way that we can read into the sociocultural significance of like 1 Corinthians 11 or something like that? And the Lord's Supper. What's the social context that's going on there? So that's observations based out of context. Other sorts of observations that we can make are observations about the way a text uses other texts. So, for example, does your text quote a passage from the Old Testament? Does it quote a passage from another piece of literature? Does it allude to other people from the Old Testament or other events from the Old Testament? These are what we would call intertexts. These are examples of an author using the work of another author to make their point. So, and the question is, why do they use them? Do they make any changes to this material? How does this material, what sources are they relying on to make their points? So that's observations about intertext. And then finally, one thing that we need to be very aware of is the idea of our own context, my context, or what we might call what's in front of the text. And the things that are in front of the text, if the historical background and the occasion are behind the text, and then you have the text itself, now we're talking about readers encountering the text. We talk about the reception of the text. How has this passage been received in the history of interpretation? Does the passage have a reputation? Is it used to establish certain doctrines? Or is it used in our own culture to prohibit certain behaviors or encourage certain behaviors? Does it have a reputation? Also to ask the question about canon. The issue of canon is something that comes in front of the text. These texts have already been written, and then they're compiled by certain people. They're put in a certain order, and that affects maybe the way that they are read. Matthew might have priority over Mark, historically speaking, but does that affect maybe the way we understand which has priority or which comes first, exegetically or historically? And then to ask the question about, what about my own social location, where I have been, my race, my gender, where I have been brought up, my socioeconomic status? Does that help me to see certain things in the text, or does it hurt me? Does it veil certain things in the text? And as we go along, I'll talk about my own issues about coming to grips with my own social location and how that has affected my reading of Scripture. And of course, we're reading a good book about the Bible in a global context and looking at some what might have been minority voices in biblical interpretation and asking, what can we hear and what can we learn about that? So these are all examples of what sort of observations, some resources that we might use as we think about the idea of interpreting the Bible and where we might go, what sort of observations we might use when I'm doing an exercise or I'm doing an interpretive observation assignment with my group. What are the sorts of things I'm looking for?